This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Joanna Davis-McElligatt, who teaches in the Department of English at University of North Texas. In addition to a number of scholarly essays and edited collections on literature and graphic arts, she is the author of the forthcoming Black Aliens, narrative Spacetime and the Cosmic Diaspora, due out in 2026. In this conversation, we discuss the place of the Black literary tradition in the study of Black life, disciplinary limits and possibilities, and how comics, graphic arts, and aesthetic questions they raise expand the Black studies imagination. Good morning, Joe. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Well, welcome to the new year. We're recording this the second week of January. As we were talking before, it's kind of like the old years. It's kind of sticking with us this year. In spirit, let's just leave it neutral. But I'm really glad that you made time for this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. And I think your contribution to the series is going to be a really important and interesting one. I think the kind of work you do for Black studies, for cultural studies, and literary studies in the relationship to Black life is really unique and interesting and important. So having this on the series is a real treat. Really happy to have your voice as part of it. And all a long way of saying welcome to the Black Studies Podcast, and I look forward to talking.
Thank you so much. I'm happy. I'm really happy to be here.
So we'll have a chance to talk, about your work and give you a chance to reflect on the relationship of that work to the history and future of Black studies. But I really wanted to start with a more personal question, which is to ask you, what drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And for me, always a companion question to that, which is what sustains you in relationship to this kind of work?
I think, I was drawn to this work because I'm Black. It's just not to put too fine a point on it. And if I could, go back to the earliest murmurings of what Black studies was, my dad decided when I was 4 that he was going to go get his college degree. And so he moved us to Chicago, outside of Chicago, Wheaton, Illinois. And he went to college at DuPage and Wheaton College, and he got his BA, MA, and MDiv in 5 years.
Oh, wow.
And I know. This is crazy.
It's a kind of a crazy standard for the kid. Come on now.
Yes, correct. And then, it was like somebody told him, because he was first gen, his father, Theodore Roosevelt Davis, was a landscaper. He died when my dad was 10 of a heart attack. And he was much, much older than his mother, Mary Alice, who had 8 kids at home. And, so the idea of going to college, was sort of novel to him, I guess. I could, it wasn't a cultural expectation. It wasn't a social expectation. And, then he decided that he was going to go get his PhD from the University of Iowa. He thought about going to Princeton, but my mom was like, I'm not moving my children there. Lifelong Midwesterner. And so we moved to Iowa and he got his PhD. And somewhere in the middle of that time, his dissertation was called Black and Human. It was an exploration of Martin Luther King Jr. on the mattering of what it means to be fully a person. And, in the midst of his, because he finished his PhD until he was 20. So my entire life, my entire childhood, my dad was in school. He was either in his BA or getting his PhD. And I also wound up getting my PhD from University of Iowa a decade after he got his PhD from University of Iowa. And so I think that was really watching my father's negotiation of Black thought in particular that impressed on me that it was necessary work for me to do as a Black woman. Like I remember when he was writing his dissertation, one of his committee members, was like, "Well, I don't think that King is like a major figure. I don't know what you're doing here. Like, what?" He got his PhD in religious studies, um, and so watching him have to sort of fight and take that territory to make a case that Martin Luther King Jr. is an important figure to be writing about in religious studies is just wild to me.
Yeah, that is
Uh,
actually.
yeah. Yeah. And so watching him have to like blaze those trails. And then also, my own experience in school, I took a Black studies class when I was in college. There was only one. It was offered once a year in the fall semester. And so it was like really hard to get into it. And the theme was on sports. And I remember being just so disappointed because the one right before then had been about film. But I learned so much in that class about different approaches to Black life, about different ways that Black folks had conceived of themselves. As athletes, we read Arthur Ashe's um, autobiography, and we read a reader on Allen Iverson. And it was just like sort of incredible to me, all the sort of dynamic ways that you could think about Black life, even about something as interesting to me as sports. And so I would say that, my entree into Black studies has always been maybe about the recovery of Black life, about wanting people to see or grapple with the work that we produce, our culture, especially in areas where I can tell otherwise that wouldn't be the case, in English departments are sort of historically really white, really European. And so a lot of the work that I do in Black studies, I see for myself as bringing Black art, Black aesthetics, Black culture to the front of the room, to make it fully integrated into the work that we do, to bring that work to my students. So I hope that answers the question. That's how I approach it in general.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. I mean, how did that sort of, that's like crazy. Two things, like one Black studies class a year is, it's
I was at University of Kansas. It was like,
it's wild. I think probably not uncommon at a lot of colleges and universities, but also the fact that it was popular. I mean, this is always I don't even know what it is, if it's the paradox or the logic, just the logic of racism in academia.
Absolutely.
And in higher ed is this like, high demand, low support, low offer.
Absolutely.
But how did did that carry over, same sort of experience carry over to graduate school? Or did you find it was part of the sort of graduate school experience, but also choice making about changing that? Like, let me not end up in this situation where the sort of study of Black life is a once a year thing, and it might be film or it might be sports.
Yeah, I was very lucky when I went to I went to the University of Iowa, and Horace Porter was there, who was a scholar of Baldwin, and my mentor Linda Bolton, who was Black Indigenous scholar. And even my dissertation director, Harold Ostacopoulos, he's, a Greek dude. He's American Greek. But he, was deeply invested and always been deeply invested in my areas of research. And there were a few people at my undergraduate mentor, Doreen Fowler, she recently passed. But I took a class from her my senior, or maybe it was my junior year, on, I don't know what the class was called. I mean, it was just like a general American lit class. But the focus was on like reading Faulkner, and we read Styron, we read Baldwin, we read Morrison. And I think that sort of left this impression on me that, I could demand when I went to graduate school that these courses take shape for me, whether or not that would be in an independent study or, and sort of knew enough when I went to Iowa that, it was like a very focused on cultural studies, and comparative cultural studies. There were a lot of courses that we took with people in Spanish Portuguese department or people in Francophone studies department. Or so I felt like when I was there, like my work it wasn't marginalized in the same way. At the same time, I never took any classes in African or African American studies, which I now think has been dissolved at Iowa. And I'm not sure if that's because they weren't offered at the graduate level, which might be the case. It still felt like even though I had professors who were teaching courses, somebody to work my dissertation, plenty of people who could I could take classes from. I took a lot of classes from Vershawn Young in rhetoric. He was hugely important and influential for me. But I still felt, like it wasn't a primary focal point. And that I was doing something kind of niche, for an English department, which was, I have a sort of longstanding beef with English departments. And I also think, my focal point at Iowa wound up becoming ethnic studies. My first job at University of Louisiana, I was hired to teach ethnic studies. I think in part because of like a perception that Black studies was not significant enough to carry the day.
Yeah.
That who could write a dissertation all about Black people. And then this is about, I finished my PhD in 2010. It was fairly recently. So I would say that even though there were Black scholars employed there, even though Black studies courses, Black literary studies were on the books, it didn't feel central to the program in a way that I think it would be if I'd gone maybe to Michigan or something.
I see. Well, let me ask you about the field of Black studies, the study of Black life. Like, what's that portrait for you? What is that idea of Black studies and Black study that you work with? And I'm asking this, generally, but also shaping it a little bit in terms of the origins of the field, which was that tension at its origin where students demanded that there be a place on campuses for the study of Black life. And Black studies was going to be that place that, disciplinary departments hadn't covered in any kind of adequate way Black people's lives and histories. And so that intellectual tradition of Black studies really has its roots in that moment, a demand for not just a change in the broad curriculum, but a change in like where you study and how you study and what you study at the department level and name. But of course, this is the late 1960s, early 1970s, where the radicalization of Black liberation struggle had really contested, if not outright erased, those boundaries between, books and political action, between campuses and communities, between study and radical prescriptive mobilization. And so, Black studies also has that tradition and that commitment to a certain kind of political vision, a certain politics of liberation and struggle and community. And I think that tension at its origin is still a tension in the field today, that we sort of think both those things at once, but they can have conflict as well. So sort of in the context of that founding of the field 50-something years ago, I'm interested to hear that what's the portrait of Black studies that you work with? What's that picture? What's that idea?
Yeah, I always loved that idea of students going in and demanding that people teach these courses. And so I think in some ways I see myself, maybe for better or worse, still having to carry on that function by insisting that I teach these courses, that I make them available to my students, and that I direct dissertations and I nurture my students, that I write letters for them, that I create community for them. But so I would say that, I think of myself in that activist tradition. I think about the first professors who said, fine, we're going to do this. I'm going to teach a Black feminist studies class, and the thrill and excitement. I just edited a book on Bell Hooks's radical pedagogy with my two long-term collaborators, Maya Butler and Megan Pfeiffer, and Beverly Guy Sheftal wrote the introduction, or wrote the foreword. And, she mentioned in there that, she and Bell, she knew her as Gloria, would take these courses together and would met at conferences and would stay up all night talking, just the thrill and excitement of being in a community for the first time with people who share your intellectual commitment. And at the same time, I always think, I go back to my father. He got his PhD, and then he was like, had zero interest in using that PhD in academia. He created something called the Urban Ministry Institute, which provides seminary education to urban poor. So if you can't read, they have modules where he'll read it to you. It's been translated into, multiple different languages. His perception of education was, I get this education, but no other Black guy that I know in my neighborhood could afford to go to Wheaton College Seminary. It's prohibitively expensive. So education for him was, I'm going to get this knowledge, and I'm going to package it in a way that other people can have for free. And I'm always really sort of fascinated and inspired by Bell's example there too. That education, that the education I have isn't meant to be gatekept. That it's meant to be, I don't want to say given freely, because they're not pearls before swine necessarily, but this perception that, my object here with what I've learned is not to keep it within the confines of the academy. To be constantly thinking about ways for me to reach and teach communities that are really hungry for conversation about Black life, have incredible ideas about Black futures. And so, I think that even now that I'm about to be tenured for the second time, I still feel myself sort of leaning toward and wanting to create programs in the public or community book clubs, or one of my colleagues has just started teaching in prison, so wanting to join her in that endeavor. So it seems to me like when I think about that Black intellectual tradition, it's like people who came from nothing, who taught themselves how to read, who taught themselves how to think so they could write their own way. And that's always been like a source of not just inspiration, but when I think about like the field memory, that's what I think about when I think about the history of Black studies.
I love that. Thank you for that. It was very thoughtful and interesting and really compelling. It's a reminder of, I think that a lot of times in these conversations, not Black Studies podcasts necessarily, but here as well, but in the field of Black Studies, that idea of community and its engagement is often opposed to or put in really intense tension with education, like formal education, because we so clearly or so comfortably, I think overly so, it's my own view, associate education, the experience of education, teacher, student, classroom, with the institution. But as you point out, there's a whole other thing going on here, and the way it spreads out and like floods outside that classroom potentially, as you said with your father, which is amazing, right? He's like, actually, let me make this education do something while outside the classroom, while also being so deeply rooted in that classroom, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So let me ask a little bit then about your work. You work in this mix of cultural studies, literary gender theory, aesthetics, and I think this combination of approaches and interests just have so much potential and give so many potent insights for the field of Black studies. And so I want to ask you, reflecting on your own work and the kind of orientation that you have and writing that you've done, how you think your work fits in the history of Black studies, and also where it opens up new horizons or pushes boundaries in the field that challenge us in new and unique ways.
So I would say one of the sort of primary things I'm interested in. So I would say I always say I'm a scholar of Africana studies first, and then Southern studies, broadly read U.S. Southern studies, but then Global South, and then comic studies. And when I'm really lucky, I get to write about all three at the same time. And so when I think about Black comic studies, I always think about that Stevie Wonder jam in Bamboozled, like, let us never be a misrepresented people. Um, Part of like the history of cartooning is to degrade Black people. It is central to the language of what it means to be a cartoonist. It's just anti-Blackness through and through. And so it's incredible and amazing to me how innovative and adaptive and clever Black folk are. So to take out of this degrading, dehumanizing miasma of bullshit that has animated representations of Black people and create new ideas of new visions of Black life. So when I study Black comics, I am overwhelmingly interested in representations of Blackness, representations of Black hair, representations of Black bodies, Black faces, alongside, stories. And so one of the things is I don't really study superhero comics. I tend to study independent comics. And those in particular, because they're not able to rely on the sort of ridiculous tropes of superheroics, really have to be innovative and creative. And that's really what excites me about Black folk is their I don't even know the word for it. Their continual ability to thrive and surprise. One of my favorite books that I always give my students, I'm directing a thesis on women's and gender studies right now, and my students wanting to write about Black motherhood. And I said, well, you need to read, but Some of Us Are Brave, which is like a anthology that lays out a trajectory for how we might go about doing Black literary studies, archival work, critical work, analytic, creating syllabi, creating community to think through these things. And like part of that is, another scholar that I think about a lot is Anna Julia Cooper. I wrote an essay about Anna Julia Cooper some years ago. And she's always been like she's become like a fundamental touchstone for me. I was the first Black woman tenured at my department at University of Louisiana, and I'll be the first Black woman tenured in my department here. And so when I think about like the idea of being a trailblazer, which is a word that I hate, I also think that also comes with like not a burden, but a great responsibility to sort of be grounded. And so one of the things that I also really love about, especially Black feminist thought, is the way that they ground themselves in intellectual traditions that they create. One of the things that Anna Julia Cooper says is that Black women are amazing because they have the capacity to like sire themselves, to create themselves. I love that idea of Black women and Black folk in general, starting from, ostensibly nothing but themselves and then creating an entire body of thought around it, scaffolding it, finding new areas, finding new ways to find things, right? How do you even research slavery? Somebody figure that out. And so, part of that for me has also been thinking about imagining otherwise, the importance of thinking about Black futures. In many of my classes, I show them that Alicia Libby Wormsley billboard, there are Black people in the future. And we talk about why that was such a spicy and ridiculous concept to people, that they would feel the need to remove those billboards. And so I think in my and another thing that I would say that I'm very interested in is I grew up, because we were on college campuses, in international family housing. And we were at Wheaton College, which is overwhelmingly white. And we were at Iowa, which again is overwhelmingly white. And so most of our friends who were Black were from the Caribbean. They were from African nations. And so I grew up in this world where Black folk, to me, didn't just mean folks like myself. My ancestors were enslaved in Mississippi and Texas. They were coming from Nigeria, or they were coming from Trinidad and Tobago, or they were coming from Haiti. And so like imagining myself and as the descendant of slaves in this country, then is also part of like a rich diasporic and ongoing immigrant community that's constantly in flux. Like Blackness is constantly changing and in flux. And I think in my monograph, Black Aliens, It started out with, with me thinking about, I wanted to write about Black immigrants. Most of my students here who are Black are immigrants. Dallas has I think it's the nation's largest population of Nigerians
I didn't know that.
are in Dallas. Yeah. So, the vast majority of my students, they will be Black, but they will, be recent immigrations, first generation or second generation immigrants. Let's wait, but Black aliens, I wanted to sort of think about that longstanding tension in Black studies, at least a tension that I perceive, between what it means to be from here and what it means to be from somewhere else, and how do we negotiate our relationship with the U.S. nation state and all these other places. What does it mean to be African American? What does it mean to be Haitian American? How do I find a home place? How do I fashion a home place? So I know that's a very meandering answer, but those are the things that I would say that really drive my interest.
Yeah, not meandering at all. Super interesting. Thank you for that. By the way, just as a side note, actually not a side note, to your first part of your comment, especially, I think you're the fourth person who does comic studies on the podcast.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I've had Biko Carruthers, Kiana Whitted,
cool, yep.
and Rebecca Wanza.
Yep.
So,
man, Kiana's a real one. So is Rebecca. Yeah, really great for them.
Yeah, so I hadn't realized that now we have a sort of core of Black comic studies. We should do a separate, Ashley and I have been talking about starting to develop some podcasts that are thematic rather than one-to-one. And so maybe one on comics would be really great now that we got you.
I just published an essay with a group of, I was the president of the Comic Studies Society, and part of my goal there was, because it's historically been super white field, was to create a space and community for junior Black comic scholars, and we just published an essay together called Black Comic Studies Now. It's a huge happening, and it's super exciting, thrilling to see. I mean, that's I guess what I mean. Like, Black folk will find a way to do stuff. Period.
Love that. Yes.
Yeah.
So let me ask a little bit more then about your work. You've already talked about, your PhD was in English, and you're in an English department now. And so both it's a sort of consistent disciplinary training and appointment, but also your work is really expansive in terms of its engagement with Black study and Black studies. And so I'm interested to hear a little bit more about your work, how you think about your work in relation to Black studies through that disciplinary training. Like, how do you think that passage sort of back and forth between discipline and non-disciplinary approaches to thinking has impacted and shaped how you conceive research projects, but also maybe how you conceive and practice a classroom?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was hired here to teach Black diasporic literature. And that has been, massively important to me. One of the biggest frustrations of my time in grad school was that I started reading Fanon and Spacetime and Glissant, especially Glissant's work on Southern Lit. And I was so excited to write about it in my dissertation. And they said, well, you can't do that because it's in French, so you have to go learn to read French so you can translate it. And I think that they thought that I wouldn't do it, that I would just say, oh, it's too much work. But I did it. I delayed my time, and I took the courses in French, and I did my own translations. And it started to make me realize that this perception that they have in English departments about Anglophone first is really prohibitive for my research and my thinking about what it means to be a Black person. And that there's just a wealth of shit we just can't read. I began to want to sort of move away from English as a discipline to literary and cultural studies. And I think that one of the reasons why I keep winding up English departments is because my real love is the aesthetics of the novel, literary aesthetics, the play, the poem, but then part of the problem of being in an English department is that its ideas of disciplinarity are sort of anathema to the work that I want to do. And so I feel like I'm kind of constantly in a state of flux and tension with an English department. where, for example, this semester I'm teaching a class on Black monsters, and I have 40 students in the class, which is a lot for a humanities class. And we were talking about, what majors they were in. I mean, they're coming from all over the university. I have some English majors, but not overwhelmingly in that class. And that really strikes me as like sort of the difficulty that I feel like I have with English is that I always have like one toe in it and then, 9 toes elsewhere. And one of the frustrations that I have, especially with English as a discipline, is that I don't think that it has grown or expanded as quickly as other maybe this is the case for all disciplines. I don't know, maybe somebody in philosophy or somebody in history would say the same thing about their disciplines, but it just seems like it's not grown or expanded. It's not contended with its past well enough. And that's one of the things that I love about Black studies is, there's this defining collection called African American Literary Theory. It starts with, Henry Louis Gates Jr. and sort of moves through the major epochs of, defining canon building, defining the sort of thematic objects, moving from like this logic of from slavery to freedom to then sort of complicating, well, what does freedom mean, and then I feel like Black studies is always pushing itself to change. I'm ceaselessly amazed, by the new developments, in Black studies, and the way that it is sort of constantly critiquing itself. I'll never find people more willing to be, challenged, more willing to be told that they're wrong, more willing to be defensive than in Black studies. It seems like that's part of what excites me about it, is it's always moving, and shifting the terrain. And English feels like a discipline that wants to be stuck where it is, and so I think I maybe haven't always done the best job of, because I feel like I've always been like a quasi-adversarial relationship with my own discipline. I want to talk about Black literary art. I want to talk about Black aesthetics in film. They don't necessarily want to do it the way that they're doing in English department. And so one of the things that I wish that English departments could gain from Black studies is that sense of wonder, that desire to improve, that desire to be self-referential, but then self-critical. I mean, and even at the level of the scholar themselves, that I think, but I would say also, when it comes to my teaching, it is very thrilling to have 40 students want to take a class about Black horror, and think critically about what it means, why Black people would want to imagine themselves as monsters, why does Sinners as a horror film come to different conclusions than some movie like Twilight. And I think that, I wouldn't say that the good always outweighs the bad, but I do see that I serve a very particular function, and a very necessary function in my department, but it's not always a function that I like. I do sometimes, right now I'm the only Black scholar in my department. And that comes with a certain amount of, that's good. I mean, I'm having my doctoral students over for dinner later tonight. We're going to, break bread and make plans. But also there's a kind of loneliness in it. And one of the things that was one of my biggest regrets when I was done with my PhD, and I was thinking, what would you have done again over? I absolutely would not have pursued a PhD in literary studies. I think that I could have accomplished what I'm doing now in a Black studies department. And so, my kid is 14, but when it comes time for him to think about college, we will have real conversations about where would you like to go, I think that had I had an opportunity to go, even maybe if I had an opportunity to study English at Spelman or Howard or something, I might have come to different conclusions.
Yeah, I mean, I think English departments really strike me as tough to track in terms of patterns. I'm 49% literally not 50%, 49% in English,
Oh wow.
here. And English
Oh wow.
here is the primary focus is Black lit, African American lit
Oh.
in particular, and has been for a very long time. But you know, all departments that have graduate programs always have legacy focuses, and this is one here. Mary Helen Washington and Merle Collins were in the department. They retired. Sadly for me, the year after I got here, and so
Oh wow.
I still see Mary Helen now and then, and Merle very rarely, but that set a sort of trajectory and tone. But I will say, as someone with a PhD in philosophy, that any complaints you have about English, you should never contemplate the slow movement of philosophy around these issues. It's catastrophic. Some areas of philosophy, I think, have made some really amazing changes, and some phenomenal work has come out of it. But boy, is that just few and far between.
Yeah, it's rough. And I think I actually Mary Helen in a department, founded or created or with a scholar of her caliber, it would have probably been a different thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I definitely came out okay. I'm grateful for the scholars that molded me and taught me, but I'm not going to sit here and say that English departments aren't. Be careful, be wise about which one you go to is what I would say.
Yeah. Well, as one of the last two questions I wanted to ask us, sort of ask big questions here to wrap up. First of the last two, what do you think Black Studies as a field has done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
I'm going to speak about. Well, I can speak about Black Studies more. Oh, this is what I'll say. I really, have been following. Some years ago, when I was in Louisiana, one of my students gave me a copy of Afro-Pessimism, Mulderson's Afro-Pessimism, and been reading it. And I hadn't read that one yet. And they were just blown away by the ideas that it presented. Mm-hmm. And, I see all kind of people debating Afro-Pessimism, how are we going to what extent do we want to deal with these ideas, and how formative or foundational we want them to be going forward. And I just love that. I love that we could have a, new, potentially devastating, depending on who you are. I was describing some Afro-pessimist ideas to my father, who again wrote his dissertation on Black and human and was not questioning the human in that way at all. He was really fascinated. Wow, it's been a while since I'd been in there to see what people are thinking. The newness of Black studies, and the willingness of people to take ideas on and try them out is just, amazing to me, powerful to me. But one of the things I would say, that sort of continually surprises and distresses me is the real difficulty that we're having still with defining what is the Black and Black American. Mm-hmm. I'm seeing about this recent, which is ongoing, consistent backlash from the administration against Somalis, their continual abuse of Haitians. I just saw that they were trying to make it difficult for Nigerians to come here. I think about ADOS. Do you know about ADOS? Yeah. I wrote my dissertation about Black immigrants, and trying to think through what do we mean when we say Black. This semester I'm teaching Adichie's Americana. It's a novel set in the United States, but Adichie lives in Nigeria. She has no interest in being American. I wrote in my monograph about Maisie Card's novel These Ghosts Are Family, which flits back and forth between Jamaica and Georgia and New York, and or Ya Jesse's Homegoing, which is these two parallel narratives between one family coming from one family. Well, there are two sisters, and one is trafficked in slavery to the New World, and the other one stays behind in Ghana. I edited a collection on Edwidge Danticat, not that long ago. And when I teach my students, like my last dissertation that I directed, my graduate student is in Tunisia, which presented really interesting questions about what does it mean to be, because she's not Black, she's Arab, she's Muslim, she's African, but she's not Black. And so one of the things, I wouldn't say that that it's not been done badly, but that I think that now it's more pressing than ever that we collectively reimagine what Blackness means in a political sense. Because what happens to Somalis could happen to me, could happen to you, could happen to anyone. And that our fates are intertwined. The 14th Amendment, and the Immigration Restriction Acts, the Immigration and Nationality Acts, almost always when it comes to Black justice, immigrant justice has been right there.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think especially for me, it's been important that I put an emphasis on thinking through what it means that there's a diversity of different kinds of folks who call themselves Black in this country, and that they have different sorts of experiences as a consequence of that.
Yeah, and no, it's for me an interesting. First of all, just an intro podcast reference. Very early on in the series, I did one with Kianga Yamada Taylor, and this was one of the things she said, that that the demographics of Black Americans at the founding of Black Studies, and in 2000, that was 2024, so 2 years ago on the calendar, but the demographics of Black in America, right, have completely changed, right? So now you're talking, from it was something like 3 to 15% being foreign born or first generation born, and the way that ought to be a challenge for Black studies in a really productive way. I think often we think of challenges as kind of like, gotcha, you fucked up, you got this wrong. But instead, it's like, what new horizons of research does this open up? The thing is especially if someone is interested in literature, this, as you pointed out, I mean, literature has taken this up a lot, whether
Absolutely.
it's a DJ or, I talked another time about I'm not a huge fan of Americana, but
yeah, it's trash.
But Donny Cod or something, all of these trans-Caribbean, transatlantic sort of movements in literature. There's so much there for Black studies at every level in terms of histories and literary study, critical theory, and all of that. So I like that. And ultimately, but for me, it's also this twist on a thing that I've said many times on the podcast and say all the time in person, which is that I think really the most interesting question of Black studies is, what is Black studies? And that's the part of me. I have a PhD in philosophy, and it's this sort of common trope about philosophy that the one real philosophical question is, what is philosophy? And people kind of laugh at that, but I'm like, no, that's the most interesting conversation you could possibly have. Like, what are we?
It's like,
what are we even talking about in the Black and Black studies, as you said? I mean, it's not just like, oh, that's an interesting question, or that's a very rich or complicated question. But as you pointed out, and Kianga and some others have pointed out in their own particular ways as well, the Black and Black studies is historically contingent in ways that are totally fascinating, and we ought to embrace that.
I totally agree.
Especially in a moment where, not to come back to this too many times across these podcasts, but we're in Black studies, we're in a time of absolute crisis for the field. I mean, this podcast is either going to be documentation of thoughts on Black studies during its crisis that it survived, or in its very end, because it's under attack at every level in almost every state. And when you're under attack, the first question is, do you have allies? And that has to do with what are relationships to communities, right? Because what does it mean to only have allies on a campus? And does anybody really think the psychology department's going to refuse to work if they shut down the Black Studies department? I do not think so. So thinking about these questions of Blackness, as you put it there, I think are also so important for the field, not just as an intellectual endeavor, which for me is plenty, but also for our very survival. I mean, what does it mean if we don't take this? And then we're like, hey, don't you want us to still exist?
Yeah, absolutely. Such a great point.
Anyway, sorry to go on about that, but this is such an interesting question and not question, an interesting issue for us to be thinking about.
Yeah, I totally agree with you.
And so maybe that's your answer to the final question, or you have another one in mind, which is in a sort of Black Studies context. Hey, it's the first 2 weeks of January, so why not be prognosticating the future, right? But what is the question you would want us to all be asking? What is the issue you would want us to all be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I guess like, how do we contend with like the overwhelming richness of Black life in a way that is both progressive, is pushing us toward a place where we've never been, but then is also cohesive. And maybe this desire for cohesion and community and collectivism is naive, but I don't really think so. As you said, things are disappearing everywhere. Or being, mushed together in ways that make them indistinguishable, or, somebody leaves and they never fill a line, or, I can you'd be naive, fool not to see it. But it also strikes me that Black Studies has thrived outside and beyond the institution, and that maybe the institution is not the best place for it to be housed singularly. Like, maybe we need to, all of us, sort of begin imagining other possibilities. And so really for me, I'm wondering, like, how do we deal with this, the diversity and the richness, then also do this in a way that calls people in, is inclusive, is also cohesive. And maybe this is like an impossible thing, but it's something that I think about, and something that I'm also, hoping to train my students to do, which is everybody, to be critical, but then also to be collegial, to be open-minded in to not be knee-jerk, to not be reactionary, to be slow and cautious and respectful in our engagement with Black thinkers, no matter where they are. And then maybe also, to encourage my students to think about ways that we can start translating, and myself, that we can start not translating, though sometimes I think my work does need to be translated, but to maybe pivot toward audiences, toward communities, toward thinkers that see themselves maybe in contention or at odds with the institution, and for very good reason. One of the things that I keep hearing everybody saying, like, what do they call it? That demographic cliff. There's just not going to be enough people. But that strikes me as bullshit. Like, people want to learn, and people are thinking, growing, and changing every day. So, and are having these, ideas about Black life every day. And so I think that's, when I think about the future of the field, I sort of, I imagine a miasma, a good miasma, a positive Black miasma, right? Where we're all able to work and think and dive in and exchange and grow and change. That's what I hope for us. I'm not sure if that's a realistic desire. Maybe it'll happen.
Hey, the idea that people continue to want to learn and converse and contest and argue and explore, if we can't hope for that, I don't know what's the point of any of this is. But that's just a really wonderful place to end, Joe. I really appreciate that so much, but also this entire conversation is really thoughtful and insightful, and is really just a fantastic contribution to the series. So thank you for your time, but also thank you for thinking really hard about these issues and really exploring them in this conversation. I appreciate that so much.
Yeah, I appreciate you inviting me. It was really wonderful.
All right. Well, you have a great rest of your day, and good luck to the start of the semester.
All right. Same to you. Bye.